For 200 years, Appalachian women ran their own farms, treated their own sick, and built entire economies the government never knew existed, all alone, deep in the hollows. History erased that and replaced it with a myth, the fragile, passive, pioneer mother, frozen in time. That myth is false. DNA has just proven it, in a way nobody expected. The truth is unsettling. Forget backwoods stereotypes and inbreeding jokes. This is a story about forced sterilization, a Supreme Court ruling the Nazis later cited in their own defense, and a state official who tried to erase entire families using nothing but a pen. By the end of this video, you'll never hear the word hillbilly the same way again. Let's begin. If you've ever taken a DNA test and turned up something in your family tree you didn't expect, tell us in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button. There's more where this came from. For most of the 20th century, historians and journalists told the same story about Appalachia. The mountains, they said, had sealed the region off since the 1700s. Everyone up there came from the same Scots-Irish stock, and generations of marrying within those closed hollows had caused the people to decline. It seemed reasonable. The terrain was brutal, roads were scarce, isolation was visible everywhere you looked. It was a comfortable assumption. It was also wrong. Long before anyone tested a single strand of DNA, paper records were already proving the myth wrong. A sociologist named Dwight Billings studied this closely. He found that the isolated and inbred version of Appalachia was a convenient story. It let people blame the region's poverty on the people themselves, instead of blaming the coal and timber companies actually draining the land. Geneticists finally tested the inbreeding claim for real. They published their results in a journal called Central Issues in Anthropology. The numbers came back completely normal, no different from any other rural people on Earth. Land deeds, tax lists, and court dockets tell the real story. These records come from eastern Tennessee, southwestern Virginia, and western North Carolina. They describe whole groups of dark-skinned families who owned land. White neighbors labeled them mulatto, or free persons of color, or mustees, an old word for people of mixed race. The most well-known of these families called themselves Melungeons. They were centered on Newman's Ridge in Hancock and Hawkins counties, Tennessee. The census takers couldn't even keep their own story straight. One household could be listed as white in 1850, mulatto in 1870, and colored in 1880. The same family, the same bloodline, relabeled again and again depending on local politics. Families with surnames like Gibson, Collins, Goins, Mullins, and Minor were targeted specifically. That label was then used to strip them of schooling, voting rights, and basic legal standing. To survive, these families invented family trees to protect themselves. They claimed they came from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, Spanish adventurers, or Cherokee ancestors, anything but the truth the law would have punished them for. You still see this pattern today. Families with mixed backgrounds, living under hostile laws, building origin stories for survival. The truth was too dangerous to say out loud, so a safer story took its place. One family shows exactly how deep this went, the Sizemores from the Virginia-North Carolina border. One household held Native American, European, and African ancestry, all at once, hidden behind a single word on a census form. We'll come back to them. That's the trap the paper record set. It forced mixed heritage families to hide who they were. Then, it punished their children and grandchildren for not hiding well enough on paper. But paper only tells you what a frightened clerk was willing to write down. To find out what actually happened inside these families, researchers needed something the law could never touch. Deep in the ridges of Hancock County, Tennessee, sits a community that ended 200 years of guessing. It's called Newman's Ridge, the historic home of the core Melungeon families. In 2011 and 2012, 4 researchers published a major study: Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane. It came out in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, titled Melungeons, a Multi-Ethnic Population. They tested two kinds of DNA in the ridge's founding families. DNA passed only from father to son, and DNA passed only from mother to child. For 200 years, the stories were the same. Portuguese sailors, lost Spanish colonists, Ottoman Turks. Now they could finally be tested against real science. This study set out to test 300 years of folklore against real science. What the DNA showed is what the rest of this video is about. The first thing the data revealed was an absence. There was no single unified story of where these families came from. No one ethnic thread ran through all of them. Instead, researchers found a split, a sharp divide depending on which parent you traced. Scientists normally expect something specific here. In a settled community, after 200 or 300 years, a father's side and a mother's side usually start to overlap. Some father's side lines and mother's side lines end up tracing back to the same regions. In the core Melungeon families, that never happened, not even close. The father's side traced mostly to one continent, the mother's side traced almost entirely to another. The two sides barely crossed at all. The father's side lines told one story. The mother's side lines told a completely different one. That raised an uncomfortable question. How does a whole community end up with two family trees that never meet? Researchers looked at the father's side DNA and the mother's side DNA separately. If Newman's Ridge really was one single isolated community, both DNA lines should have pointed to the same homeland within a generation or two. They didn't. The father's side DNA told a clear story. The core Melungeon families belonged mostly to a genetic group scientists label E1b1a. That group traces back to sub-Saharan Africa. The mother's side DNA told the opposite story. It belonged almost entirely to European genetic groups, mostly one scientist's label H tracing back to Northern and Central Europe. A single isolated people wouldn't produce a split like that. What would produce it is unions between African men and European women in the Chesapeake Tidewater back in the 1600s. This happened generations before slavery became fully written into colonial law. Back then, a free African man and a European servant could still start a family together, and it was legal. The conclusion was stark. This was never one bloodline, and it was never isolated. Geneticists have a name for this, a sex-biased split, meaning the mother's side and the father's side trace back to completely different parts of the world, and this split has a face. Mahala Mullins was born in 1824 on Newman's Ridge. People called her Big Haley. She became the most successful moonshiner in the region and the hardest to catch. In her final years, she weighed so much she couldn't leave her own cabin. The local sheriff told the county court she was, in his words, catchable but not fetchable. Her descendants carry that same split, European DNA on the mother's side, African DNA on the father's side. Her own body was living proof of a relationship her state would later make illegal. This same pattern on the mother's side shows up across the wider region, not just among the Melungeons. In 2003, researchers Deborah Bolnick and David Smith published a study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. They found something striking. Rural Appalachian families carry Native American genetic signatures on the mother's side, far more often than the white families around them. A regular store-bought DNA test can lose these signals within 5 or 6 generations. Each generation cuts your genetic tie to any one relative in half. But this mother-to-child DNA doesn't dilute. It passes from mother to daughter unchanged, generation after generation, no mixing, and no census taker could ever touch it. Isolation left its own separate mark. In the hollows of Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, a rare genetic mutation showed up in a very visible way. A French orphan named Martin Fugate married a woman named Elizabeth Smith. Both of them carried the same rare gene. Their descendants were born with skin that had a real blue-gray tint. This trait, known as the blue fugates, showed up for 7 generations because the community stayed so tightly intermarried. A different mutation arrived with Irish immigrants from County Donegal. It causes a fatal disease of the heart and nerves. Doctors in the region still track it in their clinics today. These aren't stereotypes. They're real, proven genetic mutations. Each one traces back to a real person, someone who arrived, and a family they had children with. That is history, written directly into DNA. Mixed ancestry on the colonial frontier wasn't only a Melungeon thing. It happened all across the Chesapeake region in the 1600s. African and European laborers worked side by side. They lived side by side. Sometimes they fell in love. This was all before slavery hardened into a fixed, permanent racial system where people were legally treated as property. As history goes, that part is almost ordinary. But context changes everything. In most cases, this created a handful of families. Those families were absorbed into the wider people within a generation or two, with little trace left behind. On Newman's Ridge, something different happened. This same pattern repeated across dozens of connected households, all on one ridge, all out in the open for over 200 years. It never once became invisible enough to escape the law. DNA alone can't tell us whether those founding relationships were freely chosen or shaped by the huge power imbalance of indentured servitude. That's a system where a person owed years of unpaid labor with very little say in their own life. Your genes can't answer that question. They never will. What we do know is what happened next. For the next 200 years, their descendants hid exactly who they were, because the law had decided their very existence was a crime. We've known for decades that Jim Crow-era racial laws devastated Black and Native American families across the American South. What makes it personal is this. Appalachian women often carried more than one erased ancestry in the same household. And that's exactly where these laws hit hardest. Remember Aggie Sizemore Minor, born around 1775 in the Virginia-North Carolina borderlands. Her father, George All Sizemore, had a known Native American bloodline on his father's side. Her mother was white and European. Aggie herself married into a Melungeon family whose father's side line traced back to sub-Saharan Africa. 3 ancestries, 1 household. Women like Aggie stood at the exact point of collision where an old multi-ethnic reality met a legal system with room for only 1 box to check. In 1924, that system took legal form. Virginia passed something called the Racial Integrity Act. A state registrar named Walter Plecker used this law to run what's on record as a campaign of bureaucratic genocide. He sent warning letters to local clerks, kept lists of families suspected of having colored ancestry, and made sure households like Aggie's were never again legally recorded as white or Native American. By 1896, more than 2,000 of her own descendants had organized into a group called the White Top Band of Cherokee Indians. They asked the federal government to officially recognize them as a tribe. They were denied. Their own survival documents couldn't produce the unbroken paper trail the government demanded. Those were the same documents their families had faked for generations just to stay safe. The ancestry was real. The paperwork wasn't enough. That same year, Virginia passed a second law, the Eugenical Sterilization Act. This one targeted a different group of women, poor, rural women the state labeled feeble-minded. The 2 laws fed the same regional stereotype from opposite directions. Appalachian women were praised as racially pure in one law and punished as genetically degenerate in the other. Both stories were convenient, neither was true. The test case was an 18-year-old named Carrie Buck. She was committed to a state institution called the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Carrie had just given birth to a daughter, Vivian, conceived when Carrie was raped by her foster family's own nephew. Her court-appointed lawyer believed in this himself, the idea that you could improve the human race by controlling who gets to have children. He called no witnesses. He challenged nothing. On May 2, 1927, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that Virginia's sterilization law was constitutional. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. wrote the majority opinion himself. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Vivian, the baby used to justify that ruling, later made her school's honor roll. She died at age 8 from an infection. Carrie's own younger half-sister, Doris Buck Figgins, was sterilized under this same law. Doctors told her she was just having her appendix removed. Virginia performed roughly 8,300 forced sterilizations under this program. North Carolina performed close to 7,600 more. The reach of this case didn't stop at Virginia's border either. Years later, Nazi defense attorneys at the Nuremberg trials cited this exact case. They used it, along with a model law from an American who believed the same thing. Their argument, their own mass program of forced surgery, had simply followed America's lead. We don't know whether a family like the Sizemores or the Bucks could have fought either law and won. What we do know is the outcome. An entire generation of Appalachian women learned one lesson. Survival meant staying silent on every point the law was willing to punish. Pull it all together and a quiet picture emerges. It's harder to sit with than any dramatic collapse story would be. The unmaking of Appalachian identity took 3 separate forms stacked on top of each other. The Racial Integrity Act relabeled families on census forms for decades. Roughly 8,300 forced sterilizations erased the next generation in Virginia alone, with thousands more in North Carolina. And household after household made the same quiet choice: bury the old family stories rather than risk repeating them out loud. Even the region's own dialect became a casualty of that silence. Appalachian English still uses grammar and pronunciation from Elizabethan England and from Old Scots-Irish speech. These are patterns that vanished from Britain itself centuries ago. But mainstream American culture spent 100 years mocking that accent, treating it as proof of backwardness. So generation after generation, people learned to drop it instead of defend it. Then came the final push. Between 1940 and 1970, a huge wave called the Great Appalachian Migration pushed roughly 3.2 million people out of the mountains. Coal mines switched to machines instead of workers. Small family farms collapsed. The hollows emptied out. Harlan County, Kentucky lost 1/3 of its people in this window alone. The migration didn't cause any of those 3 things by itself. It didn't need to. All it had to do was scatter an already broken people. Far enough that whatever memory was left couldn't hold together anymore. The math is brutally simple. 3 forms of erasure stacked on top of each other in a single century, hitting a people that never had the numbers to absorb the loss. The story rarely made it out. The molecule always did. Picture a mountain porch at dusk, the hollow going dark around it, a woman sitting alone. Somewhere down the ridge, she can hear children playing, children who aren't hers. She had no way of knowing what had already been taken from her. That woman was Doris Buck Figgins. As a teenager, doctors told her she was having her appendix removed. It was a lie. She spent the next 50 years trying to have children her body could no longer give her. In 1980, a Washington Post reporter found her medical file and told her the truth. She described herself as heartbroken above all else. All she'd ever wanted was her own babies. That is a life. Genetics has given us more than genetic signatures and percentages. Mahala Mullins, defiant and untouchable on her ridge. Aggie Sizemore Minor's own descendants, whose DNA confirmed the exact Cherokee ancestry the federal government had refused to recognize back in 1896. And a voice, finally, for the unnamed mothers who told their daughters to just say Scots-Irish and never speak of anything else, so those daughters could marry, own land, and live without fear. That legacy lives on today. It's inside the motherline DNA of millions of Americans. Most of them have no idea their family ever passed through those hollows at all. What the DNA revealed about Appalachian women is disturbing. It's disturbing exactly because it's so human. It's about displacement and erasure, about survival pushed to the outer edge of what a person should ever have to endure. But underneath all of it runs one thread. No census taker, no court, and no eugenics board ever managed to cut it. A line passed from mother to daughter, undocumented and unbroken, that refused to be erased.